For 8 months, I dismissed his crazy ex Jessica's warnings about Marcus, but when I found his secret phone with contacts from 6 different cities, I discovered the truth. Rebecca was pregnant and hospitalized with broken ribs while he lived with me. I realized Jessica had been trying to save me. Marcus wasn't my perfect boyfriend. 2 years later, FBI arrested him for stalking 12 women across 4 states. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared at the contact list that would shatter everything I believed about the man I loved. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my grip, like it contained the weight of every lie, every manipulation, every carefully crafted moment of false intimacy that had defined our relationship. Rebecca, Portland. Ashley, Seattle. Nina, San Diego. Melissa, Phoenix. Emma, Denver. Katie, Austin. And at the very bottom, in cruel irony that made my stomach lurch, Jessica, blocked. The shower was still running in our bathroom, the sound that used to comfort me now seeming ominous and threatening. Steam drifted under the door as Marcus hummed some jazz tune, the same melody he'd hummed while cooking me dinner on our first night together, the same song that had made me fall a little deeper in love with his effortless charm. He was completely oblivious that his carefully constructed world was crumbling in my shaking fingers, that 8 months of meticulous deception was unraveling in real time. Each contact had the same horrifying pattern that spoke to years of practiced manipulation. Dozens of deleted message threads that suggested constant communication, recent calls at 2 a.m. When normal people were sleeping, photos sent and received that implied intimate relationships spanning multiple time zones. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled through Rebecca's messages, each word a dagger through my chest, each timestamp a revelation that made the room spin around me. "When are you coming back?" "You said just 6 months." The timestamp showed last Tuesday, while I thought Marcus was in Milwaukee attending business meetings that I now realized were entirely fictional. "I saw your girlfriend on Instagram. Does she know about us?" My blood turned to ice as I realized this woman had been researching me, probably wondering who I was and why I was stealing her boyfriend's attention. "Marcus, I'm pregnant. Please answer my calls. I need to know what to tell the baby. The doctor says I'm having complications." I'm scared. The raw desperation in those words, the terror of a woman facing pregnancy complications alone, while the father of her child ignored her pleas, made me physically nauseous. The bathroom door handle turned. Panic shot through my veins as I quickly screenshotted everything I could, my fingers fumbling with the phone's interface. I placed his work phone back exactly where I'd found it, my heart hammering so violently I was certain he'd hear it from across the room. Marcus emerged with a towel wrapped around his waist, water still dripping from his dark hair. He looked exactly the same as he had every morning for the past 8 months, handsome, gentle, completely normal. The same warm brown eyes that had made me feel safe that first day in the hospital parking garage. The same tender smile that had convinced me I'd finally found my person. "You seem tense," he said, settling beside me on our couch with that effortless grace I'd fallen in love with. His voice carried the same concerned warmth it always did, the tone that had comforted me through countless difficult shifts at the hospital. "Everything okay, baby?" I forced my face into a mask of normalcy, though every cell in my body screamed danger. "Just tired," I managed, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. He pulled me closer with the same gentle touch that used to make me melt, stroking my hair with fingers that I now realized had touched at least 6 other women the same way. "You work too hard," he murmured against my temple. "Let me take care of you." The words that used to comfort me now made my skin crawl. How many other women had he whispered those exact same words to? How many had believed, like I had, that they were special, that they were chosen? But this devastating moment didn't happen in isolation. To understand how I ended up living with a predator, holding evidence of his monstrous deceptions while he sweet-talked me into submission, I need to go back. Back to when I thought Jessica was just a bitter ex-girlfriend spreading lies. Back to when Marcus seemed like the answer to every prayer I'd ever whispered into the darkness. Back to when I was still naive enough to believe in fairy tales. The question that haunts me now, the question that started this entire nightmare, was simple. When did you realize your partner's crazy ex was actually telling the truth about them? For 2 years, Jessica had been my tormentor. Her messages arrived like clockwork across every platform I used: Instagram, Facebook, even my professional LinkedIn account. The warnings never varied. "He's not who you think he is. Ask him about the restraining order. Check his phone while he sleeps." I'd shown Marcus every single message, watching his face crumple with that perfect mixture of hurt and exhaustion that I now recognize as masterful manipulation. He'd run his hands through his hair in that endearing way that made my heart ache for him, his voice thick with pain as he explained. "She's been stalking me since we broke up," he'd say, his brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. I feel terrible that she's dragging you into this, Sarah. The last thing I wanted was for her obsession to hurt you too. He painted Jessica as completely unhinged, weaving elaborate stories about her increasingly erratic behavior after their breakup. She'd keyed his car, he claimed, showed up at his consulting firm creating scenes that embarrassed him in front of colleagues. When he refused to take her back, she'd threatened suicide, sending him graphic photos of self-inflicted wounds and pill bottles with suicide notes attached. It was textbook crazy ex behavior, right? The kind of horror story every woman dreads becoming. The cautionary tale that made me grateful I'd never been that desperate or pathetic after a breakup. And Marcus? Marcus was absolutely incredible. He brought me coffee every single morning, not just any coffee, but my exact preference. Oat milk latte with an extra shot and no foam. He remembered every tiny detail I shared, from my lactose intolerance to my mother's birthday to my complicated relationship with my absent father. In 8 months, he'd never once raised his voice, never shown even a flicker of impatience or anger. When I got food poisoning from questionable sushi after a double shift, Marcus held my hair back while I vomited, cleaned my bathroom without a single complaint, and sat beside my bed reading medical journals aloud in his soothing voice until I fell asleep. When my mother was unexpectedly hospitalized with a heart attack, he drove 4 hours through a snowstorm with me to Indiana, slept in those awful waiting room chairs for 3 nights, and charmed every nurse and doctor until they were going out of their way to make sure Mom got the best care possible. Perfect boyfriend material didn't even begin to cover it. Marcus was the kind of man who restored your faith in love, who made you believe that maybe, just maybe, you deserved something beautiful after all the disappointments and heartbreaks that had come before. The way we met felt like destiny, like something scripted by a romantic comedy writer who understood exactly what exhausted nurse needed to hear. I was having the absolute worst day in my 3-year career at St. Mary's Hospital. 3 patients had coded during my shift, including a 34-year-old father of twins who didn't make it despite our team's desperate efforts. 2 families had screamed at the staff, one accusing us of incompetence when we couldn't save their grandmother, another furious about wait times in the emergency room. During my pathetically short lunch break, I'd spilled coffee all over my scrubs, leaving me looking as much of a mess as I felt inside. I was crying in the parking garage, slumped against my car like a complete disaster when this handsome stranger approached with a tissue and the most genuinely concerned smile I'd ever seen. "Rough day?" Marcus asked gently, his voice carrying none of the awkwardness most people showed when confronted with a sobbing woman in public. I was embarrassed to be falling apart in front of a complete stranger, but something about his warm brown eyes made me feel instantly safe. He didn't check his phone once while I vented about my terrible shift, didn't look impatient or uncomfortable. He just listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. "You're incredible for doing what you do," he said when I finally finished my rambling breakdown. "The world needs more people like you, Sarah. People who care enough to fight for others, even when it breaks your heart." I hadn't even told him my name, but somehow hearing him say it made everything feel more intimate, more meaningful. He asked for my number, and I gave it without a moment's hesitation, something I'd never done with a stranger before. Our first date was absolutely perfect. Marcus chose a quiet restaurant where we could actually talk, asking thoughtful questions about my work, my dreams, my family. He seemed genuinely fascinated by everything I said, hanging on every word like I was sharing the secrets of the universe instead of just rambling about my passion for pediatric nursing. "I've never met anyone as compassionate as you," he told me over dessert, his eyes never leaving mine. "You have this light about you, this warmth that makes everyone around you feel safe. It's extraordinary." By our third date, I was completely smitten. Marcus was attentive without being clingy, romantic without being cheesy, supportive without being patronizing. He remembered that I was lactose intolerant and always made sure restaurants could accommodate me. He knew I worked brutal double shifts on Wednesdays and would leave encouraging text messages timed perfectly to arrive during my dinner break. When he first mentioned his crazy ex, it was in the context of apologizing for being cautious about relationships, for taking things slowly with me despite our obvious connection. "Jessica really did a number on me," he said sadly during our 1-month anniversary dinner at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. "She made me feel like I couldn't trust my own judgment about people anymore. I know it's not fair to you, but sometimes I catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop." He described a woman who'd become increasingly possessive and paranoid during their 18-month relationship. Jessica had accused him of cheating with absolutely no evidence, he explained, going through his phone and interrogating him about every female coworker or friend. She'd demand to know where he was every moment of the day, showing up at his apartment at 3 a.m. when he didn't answer her calls fast enough. I tried to be patient because I thought she just needed reassurance. Marcus explained, his voice thick with pain that seemed so genuine it made my chest ache for him. But it got scary, Sarah. She'd threatened to hurt herself if I ever left her. She said she'd rather die than live without me. When Jessica's first message arrived 2 months into our relationship, Marcus's reaction seemed perfectly reasonable, concerned but not surprised, disappointed but not angry. "I'm so sorry you have to deal with this," he said, genuine distress written across his features as he read the vague threat on my Instagram. I was hoping she'd moved on by now, maybe found someone new to focus on. But apparently not. The message was frustratingly cryptic. Just ask him about Seattle. No context, no explanation, just another attempt to plant seeds of doubt in my mind. Marcus explained that Jessica often made these kinds of bizarre accusations that never led anywhere meaningful. "She does this thing where she implies I'm hiding something terrible without actually saying what it is," he said with a tired sigh that spoke to months of dealing with her harassment. "It's pure manipulation, Sarah. She wants you to start doubting me, questioning everything I tell you, so our relationship falls apart and she can swoop back in." Over the next few months, Jessica's messages became more frequent but remained frustratingly vague, each one designed to make me suspicious without providing any concrete allegations I could actually investigate. "Ask him about the second phone," came right after Marcus had gotten a work phone from his consulting company, a perfectly reasonable explanation that made Jessica's timing seem almost comically coincidental. "Ask him about the credit cards," arrived just days after Marcus mentioned having to clean up his credit following identity theft. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He claimed Jessica had stolen his personal information during their relationship and used it to open accounts, something he was still fighting to resolve 2 years later. "Ask him about Portland." Made absolutely no sense because Marcus had never mentioned Portland, had never claimed to have business there or friends there. When I brought it up casually, he seemed genuinely confused. "I've never even been to Portland," he said, frowning with what appeared to be sincere bewilderment. Why would she say that? I don't understand what she's trying to accomplish with these random accusations. I started to feel genuinely sorry for Marcus. Jessica's relentless harassment was clearly causing him real pain, and it was beginning to affect our relationship too. Every message made me feel like I was being dragged into their toxic history, forced to play referee in a drama that had nothing to do with me. But Jessica's messages kept coming, each one more specific and unsettling than the last. Ask him why he has 2 phones. Ask him about the credit cards in his dead father's name. Ask him about Rebecca in Portland. Rebecca. That name would become the crack that split my world wide open. I mentioned Rebecca casually one night while we were cooking dinner together, a cozy domestic scene that had become one of my favorite parts of our routine. Marcus was telling me about his day at work, laughing about a particularly difficult client who demanded impossible changes to a project timeline when I decided to test the waters. "Speaking of difficult people," I said, stirring the pasta sauce while trying to keep my tone light and conversational. "Jessica mentioned someone named Rebecca today." Marcus went completely still. The wooden spoon he'd been using to stir clattered against the pot as his entire body tensed. The easy smile vanished from his face, replaced by something I'd never seen before, something cold and calculating that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was different. Flat, cold, nothing like the warm tone I'd grown to love and depend on. "Just around," I said carefully, suddenly aware that I was walking into dangerous territory but not understanding why. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, his jaw tight and his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to determine how much I knew. Then, like someone flipping a switch, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Must be thinking of someone else," he said, but the damage was done. I'd seen behind the mask, if only for a moment. But I wasn't thinking of someone else. And that moment of cold fury had awakened something in me, a need to pay attention, to really observe the man I'd been sharing my bed and my heart with for the past 6 months. Marcus did have 2 phones, just like Jessica had said. He claimed one was for work, but he guarded it like it contained classified government secrets. He received calls at odd hours, 2 a.m., 5 a.m., times when no legitimate business would be conducting meetings. He'd step outside to answer them even in the middle of winter, standing in our building's lobby or on the fire escape where I couldn't overhear. When I joke about his secret agent behavior, he'd laugh it off with practiced ease, but he never changed the pattern. Never explained why work calls couldn't be taken in front of me. Never offered to put them on speaker like most people would with boring business conversations. I also started noticing how strategically he'd positioned himself in our relationship. Gradually, so subtly I hadn't realized it was happening, Marcus had become my everything. My entire social world had begun to revolve around him. My friends still found him charming when we all went out together, but somehow I was seeing them less and less frequently. Marcus always had thoughtful, reasonable explanations for why I should distance myself from the people who'd been important to me before he came along. Emma's been really negative lately, he'd observe after I hung up from my weekly call with my best friend since nursing school. I worry she's projecting her relationship problems onto you. Have you noticed how she always finds something wrong with everything you're excited about? Your mom seems so stressed when you visit, he'd say after family dinners, his arm around my shoulders as we drove home. Maybe giving her some space would be healthier for both of you. I can see how drained these visits leave you. He never forbade me from seeing anyone. Marcus was far too smart and sophisticated for such obvious control tactics. Instead, he'd plant seeds of doubt that grew in the fertile soil of my trust, nurturing my own insecurities until I was making the choice to isolate myself. Emma, who'd been my closest friend for 5 years, had stopped calling after Marcus mentioned that she seemed jealous of our relationship, resentful that I'd found happiness when her own love life was falling apart. My weekly Sunday calls with my mother had dwindled to monthly, then every few months, as Marcus convinced me that the conversations left me feeling guilty and anxious. And the most insidious part? Marcus was always supportive when I did talk to these people. He'd encourage me to call them, ask how they were doing, express concern for their well-being. But somehow, after every interaction, I'd feel drained and conflicted, like the relationships were more work than they were worth. That night, while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, the same man who'd held me while I cried about losing patience, who'd driven through a blizzard to be with me during my mother's health scare, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, finally understanding that I was living with a stranger. Every breath he took sounded ominous. Every movement made me tense. Who was this person lying next to me? And how had I been so completely, utterly deceived? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year and drove to Jessica's address. I'd found it in Marcus's contacts under blocked, with a disturbing note that read, "Emergency only. Approach with caution." The apartment complex was nicer than I'd expected. A modern building with well-maintained landscaping that suggested Jessica wasn't the unstable wreck Marcus had painted her to be. When she answered the door, the disconnect between reality and Marcus's description was immediately apparent. Jessica looked nothing like the unhinged woman from his stories. She wore professional clothes, a crisp blazer, and slacks that suggested she was either heading to or coming from an office job. Her apartment was immaculate, tastefully decorated, with family photos on the mantel and a wedding ring glinting on her finger. "You finally believe me," she said simply, stepping aside to let me in. No smugness, no "I told you so." Just the weary relief of someone who'd been telling the truth for too long. She made coffee with steady hands and spread out a manila folder on her kitchen table. The folder was thick, organized with color-coded tabs and neat labels. This wasn't the obsessive rambling of a crazy ex-girlfriend. This was documentation. Marcus operates in cycles, Jessica explained, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, like she was discussing quarterly financial reports rather than a predator's methodology. He finds women in different cities, maintains relationships with 3 or 4 at once. He tells each of us the others are crazy exes or clingy friends from work. She showed me credit card statements with names I didn't recognize, bank account records, identity theft reports. He uses information from women he's dated to open accounts, she continued. My credit score dropped 200 points before I figured out what was happening. My stomach dropped as I realized Marcus had access to all of my personal information, social security number, mother's maiden name, banking details. How much damage had he already done? "There's more," Jessica said gently, reading the horror in my expression. "And it's worse than financial fraud." She pulled out police reports, hospital records, restraining orders. Each document told the same terrifying story with different victims. The first police report was from Seattle. Ashley Martinez, 28, nurse practitioner, admitted to hospital with injuries consistent with domestic violence. Suspect fled before arrest could be made. The second was from San Diego. Nina Rodriguez, 26, elementary school teacher. Restraining order filed after escalating threats and stalking behavior. The third was from Denver. Emma Thompson, 29, social worker. Identity theft, harassment, violation of restraining order. "Marcus has a pattern," Jessica said quietly, watching me process the documentation. "He gets women isolated, financially dependent. Then the abuse starts. Psychological first, then physical." The documents painted a horrifying picture. 3 different women in 3 different cities, all with similar stories of manipulation, control, and violence. All with the same trusting smiles in there before photos that Jessica had printed from social media. "Rebecca's in the hospital right now," Jessica said, pulling out medical photographs that made my stomach lurch. Broken ribs, fractured wrist, concussion. She finally pressed charges, but he disappeared before they could arrest him. Rebecca looked exactly like me. Same hair color, same build, same age. The same naive expression I recognized from my own social media photos. He has a type, Jessica continued, her voice gentle but unforgiving. Mid-20s, works in healthcare or education, lives alone, family out of state. He researches us thoroughly before making contact. She showed me printouts that made my blood run cold. Social media profiles I'd forgotten existed. Dating app photos from years ago. Public record searches. Even my college graduation photo from a newspaper announcement my proud mother had submitted to our hometown paper. "How long have you been living together?" she asked. "6 months," I whispered. She nodded grimly. "That's when it escalates. He's probably already isolated you from friends and family." I thought about the past few months with growing horror. Marcus hadn't forbidden me from seeing anyone. He was far too sophisticated for such obvious control tactics. Instead, he'd slowly poisoned every important relationship in my life. Emma, my best friend since nursing school, had stopped calling after Marcus mentioned she seemed jealous of our happiness. My weekly calls with my mother had dwindled to monthly. Then, every few months, as Marcus convinced me the conversations left me feeling guilty and anxious about not visiting more often. The restraining orders don't work because he moves constantly, Jessica explained. He uses different names, different cities. By the time law enforcement catches up, he's already moved on to the next victim. She handed me a thick folder marked Sarah Chen, Chicago. Inside were copies of medical records, police reports, and detailed testimony from 7 different women across 4 states. I've been documenting everything for 2 years, building a case. Rebecca isn't his first victim to end up hospitalized, and she won't be the last unless we stop him. The pattern was identical every time. Love bombing phase with excessive attention, gifts, and affection, making the victim feel special and chosen. Isolation phase, gradually separating the victim from support systems through manipulation and subtle sabotage. Control phase involving financial manipulation, monitoring communications, and restricting movements. Abuse phase with psychological torture escalating to physical violence. Disposal phase, when the victim became too problematic or started fighting back, he'd disappear and move to the next target. "The other women are ready to testify," Jessica said, looking directly at me. "But we need current evidence. Something that proves he's still active, still targeting victims." She paused. "We need you to help us catch him." My hands were trembling as I processed the magnitude of what she was asking. 2 years of warnings I dismissed. 2 years of red flags I'd ignored because Marcus was so charming, so perfect, so exactly what I'd always dreamed of finding. "What do you need me to do?" Jessica explained the plan. The FBI had been building a case for interstate fraud and stalking, but they needed concrete evidence of ongoing crimes. I would continue acting normal while documenting everything: his activities, his phones, his finances, his communications with other victims. "Agent Rodriguez is the lead investigator," Jessica said, handing me a business card. "She's been tracking Marcus for 3 years. You can call her anytime, day or night. The moment you feel unsafe, you leave," Jessica emphasized, gripping my hand tightly. "Promise me. This isn't worth your life." I promised, though as I drove home, I wondered how I'd even know when I was unsafe. Marcus had never hurt me physically. He'd never even raised his voice. Everything dangerous about him was hidden beneath layers of charm and manipulation, so sophisticated I'd never seen it coming. Marcus was making dinner when I walked in, humming along to jazz music like he didn't have a care in the world. The apartment smelled like garlic and herbs. He'd opened a bottle of wine and lit candles, creating the same romantic atmosphere that had made me fall deeper in love with him every single day. "How was work, baby?" he asked, kissing my cheek with the same gentle affection as always. I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Fine. Just tired." "I made your favorite," he said, gesturing to the stir-fry. "Thought we could eat and watch that documentary you mentioned about ocean conservation." He was so normal, so loving, so perfectly attentive. For a moment, I almost convinced myself Jessica was wrong. Maybe this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. Maybe Marcus really was the victim of a vindictive ex-girlfriend with too much time and too much imagination. Then I noticed his phone buzzing on the counter. Rebecca calling. Marcus saw me looking and smoothly flipped the phone face down with practiced ease. "Spam calls," he said casually. "I've been getting them all day." Probably sold my number to some telemarketing company, but I'd seen the name. And I knew Rebecca was in the hospital with broken ribs, wondering why the father of her unborn child had disappeared without a trace. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe beside me. This man who brought me flowers every Friday, who remembered my coffee order, who held me when I cried about losing patience at work. This man who was apparently a predator of the most sophisticated kind. The next few weeks were psychological torture. I documented everything while pretending nothing had changed. His second phone, his odd hours, his carefully crafted stories about work trips that I now knew were visits to other victims. I discovered he'd been using my personal information too. My social security number to run credit checks, my mother's maiden name to set up email accounts, my work address to have packages delivered that I never saw. He'd been systematically invading my privacy for months, and I'd never noticed because I trusted him completely. I installed a hidden camera app on my phone and started recording our conversations. The casual way he lied was absolutely chilling. When I asked about his trip to Milwaukee, he described meetings and clients that I now knew were completely fabricated. He was actually in Portland with Rebecca. How was the Johnson account? I asked over dinner, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Challenging, he said without missing a beat, cutting his steak with the same precision he applied to everything. But I think we made good progress. The presentation went over well with their executive team. He was such a masterful liar that I almost believed him myself, even knowing the truth. I called Agent Rodriguez and set up a meeting at the FBI field office. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who treated me with the kind of careful compassion reserved for trauma victims. "You're very brave for coming forward," she said. "Marcus Webb, that's his real name by the way, is one of the most sophisticated predators we've encountered." She showed me his file. Real name Marcus Webb, born in Texas, age 34. History of fraud, identity theft, and domestic violence dating back to college. At least 12 known victims over 8 years. He's highly intelligent and extremely good at reading people, Agent Rodriguez explained. He studies his targets for weeks before making contact. Everything about your relationship was calculated. She showed me surveillance photos that made my stomach lurch. Marcus watching me before our chance meeting in the parking garage. Photos of him at the coffee shop where I bought my morning latte, learning my routine. Photos of him talking to my coworkers, gathering information about my personal life. How did he know I'd be in the garage that day? I asked, feeling sick. He didn't. He'd been following your schedule for 2 weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. A moment when you'd be vulnerable and receptive to a kind stranger. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Not just my safety, but the safety of Rebecca, Ashley, Nina, and all the future victims. I started my double life as an undercover FBI informant while Marcus remained completely oblivious. 3 weeks into my investigation, Marcus announced another business trip. "Denver this time," he said. 3 days. "I'll miss you." I knew he was really going to see Emma, who'd been posting increasingly desperate messages about their relationship. The moment he left, Agent Rodriguez called. "We're searching the apartment. Do you know where you might hide things?" We found everything hidden in a false bottom of his bedroom dresser. USB drives, prepaid phones, fake IDs, and most damning of all, journals. Each journal was labeled with a woman's name and contained detailed plans for manipulation and control. My journal was labeled Sarah Chin, Chicago. Target acquired March 2023. Inside were pages of observations about my habits, fears, vulnerabilities, plans for how to manipulate me, notes about my financial situation and family relationships. Subject responds well to small gestures of care. Coffee preference: oat milk latte, extra shot, no foam. Use for daily reinforcement of attentiveness. Mention of absent father during childhood triggers emotional response. Exploit for bonding opportunities and trust building. Works extra shifts at St. Mary's Hospital on weekends. Increasing fatigue makes her more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to question inconsistencies. I was reading detailed notes about how to psychologically manipulate me. Marcus had been studying me like a lab rat from day one. When Marcus returned from Denver, I was waiting in our living room with Jessica, Agent Rodriguez, and 2 other FBI agents. His face went through several expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, then that cold mask I'd glimpsed when I'd mentioned Rebecca's name. "What's this about?" he asked calmly, setting down his overnight bag like this was perfectly normal. Agent Rodriguez showed him a warrant. "Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for interstate stalking, identity theft, wire fraud, and violation of federal restraining orders." Marcus looked directly at me, his expression almost disappointed. "Sarah, whatever they've told you, it's not true. You know me." But I didn't know him at all. I'd fallen in love with a carefully constructed character designed to exploit my weaknesses. "I found the journals," I said quietly. For the first time, his composure cracked completely. The mask slipped, and I saw the real Marcus underneath. Cold, calculating, furious at being caught. You have no idea what you've done, he said as they put the handcuffs on. As they led him away, he turned back one more time. You'll regret this, he said to me. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The trial took 8 months. 6 women testified about his pattern of abuse. Rebecca spoke from a wheelchair, her injuries still healing. She'd given birth to Marcus's daughter 3 months earlier. He disappeared the day I told him I was pregnant, she said. I haven't heard from him since. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 8 years. During sentencing, his lawyer tried to paint him as a man with abandonment issues who just loved too deeply. The judge wasn't buying it. Mr. Webb treated these women like targets in a hunting expedition. You studied these women like prey. You learned their weaknesses specifically to exploit them. Marcus sat quietly throughout the sentencing, showing no emotion. But as they led him away, he looked back at the gallery where all his victims sat together. He smiled. After the trial, Jessica and I stayed in touch. She'd remarried and was expecting her first child. Rebecca was in physical therapy, but making good progress. How are you handling everything? Jessica asked during one of our coffee dates 6 months after the sentencing. Honestly, I was struggling. 2 years of my life had been a complete lie. I'd loved someone who saw me as prey. You're not stupid, Jessica said firmly. He's just that good at what he does. That's what makes him dangerous. The hardest part was trusting my judgment again. Every date felt like a potential threat. I went to therapy 2 times a week and joined a support group for survivors of psychological abuse. 1 year after Marcus's conviction, Agent Rodriguez called. He's been running a romance scam from prison using contraband phones. We're building another case, even behind bars. He couldn't stop. He'd convinced 3 different women to send him money for legal fees, claiming he was wrongfully convicted. That's when I realized something important. Marcus had tried to break me, to make me feel worthless and crazy and small. Instead, he'd made me stronger, and he'd turned his victims into a network of women determined to protect each other. Jessica, the crazy ex he'd warned me about, had saved my life. Now, I'm the crazy ex warning his current targets. And I'll keep warning them until he can't hurt anyone else. I started a blog called The Crazy X Files, where survivors share their stories. The most common comment is, I thought I was going crazy. That's how manipulation works. It makes you doubt your own perception of reality. But here's what I've learned. If multiple people are warning you about someone, listen. If your friends and family express concern about your relationship, listen. If your gut tells you something is wrong, listen. 3 years later, I'm in a healthy relationship with David, a pediatric surgeon I met at a medical conference. He's never asked me to keep secrets or question my friendships. When I told him about Marcus, he just listened and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." It must have been terrifying. David encourages me to maintain close relationships with friends and family. When Jessica visits Chicago, he insists on cooking dinner for all of us. He treats the other survivors like the heroes they are. Marcus is still in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 12 years. Jessica and I are already planning to be there when that hearing comes up. All of us will be there. Every woman he tried to destroy. We'll tell our stories again, as many times as necessary. Some exes really are crazy, but sometimes they're the heroes of the story. And sometimes the person everyone warns you about really is dangerous. Listen to the warnings. Listen to your gut. Listen to the women who came before you. Because we're not crazy. We're survivors.